What if I told you that right now, Ghana is leading a global conversation about justice for something that happened over 200 years ago? And from Ghana's point of view, it should be recognized as one of the gravest crimes in human history. On 15th February 2026, Ghana's President, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, announced that Ghana would take a bold step to the United Nations, calling for the transatlantic slave trade to be formally recognized as one of the gravest crimes against humanity. But this conversation did not start just today. Back in 2023, at the Accra Reparations Conference, President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo made a clear argument. He said, reparations should be seen as a matter of justice, not charity. And he argued that slavery and colonialism have caused deep, lasting economic and social damage to Africa. He then called for a united African and diaspora voice to strengthen the global push for reparations. Today, Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama is taking that conversation to the United Nations. So, what does all of this actually mean? Because when you hear the word reparations, you're probably thinking of one thing: a payout, one big check, or a huge sum of money being handed over to the African nations. But that is not how Ghana, the African Union, and the Caribbean nations are currently looking at it. You see, in law and in this growing global movement, reparations go far beyond money. Yes, compensations can be part of it, but it also includes restitution, rehabilitation, public apologies, truth-telling, guarantees that this kind of harm will never happen again, some debt reliefs, and the return of stolen cultural artifacts. Very important. So, in simple terms, this is not just about money. And if you're an ordinary Ghanaian like me, wondering why this should matter to you, here is your first answer. This history about the transatlantic slave trade ran through our own coastline. Ghana's coast still holds forts and castles that UNESCO recognizes as a World Heritage Site. Built between 1482 and 1786, they stretch across about 500 kilometers from Keta to Benin. Elmina Castle, for example, which was built in 1482, still stands today as one of the oldest European buildings outside Europe. And over time, it became one of the most infamous links in the transatlantic slave trade system. So when Ghana speaks today, you cannot say we're speaking from the sidelines. Ghana is speaking from one of the places where this story physically happened. And to understand why this matters today, we have to go back in history. So what exactly was the transatlantic slave trade? It was the forced movement of millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean, mainly to the Americas. This went on for over 400 years, from the mid-1400s to the late 1800s. It all began around 1444 when Portuguese traders under Prince Henry the Navigator carried one of the first recorded group of enslaved Africans from West Africa to Europe. Now, at the time, it was a small amount. But over the years, it grew into a vast and organized system involving multiple empires. By the 16th century, nations like Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands were all deeply involved in the slave trade. And they were all driven by one thing: profit. You see, by the 15th century, when European powers were expanding into the Americas, they needed labor for plantations, sugar, tobacco, cotton, and later coffee. But they had a problem. In many parts of the Americas, indigenous population had already been devastated by diseases like smallpox and measles, and by violent conquests like the fall of the Aztec and Inca empires, which led to the loss of millions of lives. So they turned their attention to Africa, and West Africa became one of the main targets for them. UNESCO describes the transatlantic slave trade as the trafficking of millions of women, men, children, mostly from West Africa and Central Africa, in a system that enriched imperial powers and helped spread racist ideas about black inferiority. Historians who are working through the slave voyages database estimate that about 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships, and of those, around 10.7 million people survived the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, to put that into perspective, the entire population of Belgium today is about 11 million people. And that's roughly the number of people who were forced out of African countries into Europe and forced into labor. But mind you, these were not just numbers. They were people, actual people with names, people with their own languages, beliefs, and skills. Some of these people were farmers, gold workers, traders, mothers, fathers, priests, children, people who held real value in their various communities, kidnapped and forced into slavery. So, how did they end up on the ships in the first place? Some were captured during wars between African states, others were kidnapped in raids, others were simply just forced, and many were sold through coastal trading systems, where European merchants exchanged goods like guns, alcohol, and textiles for human beings. But none of this was random. You see, the slave trade became part of a much larger organized system, what historians call the triangular trade. European ships would leave ports in places like Liverpool, Bristol, and Lisbon, carrying manufactured goods to the African coast. There, those goods were traded for enslaved Africans. And then from Africa, the ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean on what became known as the Middle Passage to the Americas. In the Americas, enslaved Africans were sold and forced to work on plantations. The ships were then loaded with raw materials like sugar, cotton, and tobacco, products of the forced labor from the African slaves, and then sailed back to Europe. Then this process repeated over and over again, a cycle, one that turned human lives into profit. The British slave ship Brooks, which sailed in the late 18th century, became infamous for this journey. And its detailed diagrams later were used to expose how tightly human beings were packed on board. Now, this is where people often try to muddy the conversation. Sometimes you hear people say, but were Africans already not enslaving their fellow Africans? And was it not Africans who sold Africans to the white people? And the answer is yes. Forms of slavery and servitude did exist in parts of Africa before Europeans arrived. And yes, some African rulers, merchants, and brokers participated in capturing and selling people. But that does not make the transatlantic slave trade the same thing. Not even close. Because that system was different. It was different in scale, in structure, and in ideology. The transatlantic slave trade became racialized. It reduced Africans to chattel property, something that can be owned, bought, and resold again. The transatlantic slave trade tied slavery to heredity, meaning a child could be born into bondage with no way out. And it was built to feed plantation economies across the Americas. And beyond all of that was the experience itself. People were taken from their homes, often violently. Families were separated, communities were broken, and on the journey to the coast, millions of people died. In the forts and castles where people were held, they were overcrowded in dungeons, sometimes for weeks in darkness, with little air, little food, and no certainty of what was coming next. And then came the ships, the Middle Passage, where people were chained, packed tightly together, and forced to lie in conditions so inhumane that diseases spread rapidly. Some resisted, yes, some refused to eat, some chose death over what lay ahead of them. There were some who just refused to conform. Many jumped overboard in the middle of the ocean, and some were forcefully thrown overboard when the ships faced bad weather. So yes, you can say Europe did not invent captivity in Africa, but European states, merchants, financiers, and colonial systems transformed the existing forms of bondage into a massive industrialized transoceanic system for profit. That is the difference. So when someone says, yeah, Africans were selling Africans and it was Africans who sold Africans, the right response is, that is only part of the story. The bigger question is, who created the demand? Who built the ships? Who insured the voyages? Who passed the laws that made it legal? Who ran the plantations? And ultimately, who accumulated the wealth? That is why today's reparations conversations is aimed mainly at former slave trading and colonial powers, especially European states. even though the history itself was a bit complex. And then came the abolition of slavery. And mind you, this did not happen because the slave empires suddenly became moral or gained some consciousness about the humans they were enslaving. The abolition of slavery was forced by resistance from the enslaved Africans, by growing abolitionist movements, and by major uprisings, especially the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and led to Haiti's independence in 1804. In Britain, Parliament abolished the slave trade on 25th March 1807. The United States followed, banning the importation of enslaved people from 1st January 1808. But slavery itself did not end overnight. In the British Empire, for instance, full emancipation did not come until 1838. And in Brazil, slavery lasted until 1888. And then comes one of the most uncomfortable parts of this story. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire, guess who was compensated? It wasn't the enslaved Africans, it was the slave owners. In 1833, the British government set aside £20 million, an enormous sum at the time, which was roughly 40% of its national budget, to compensate slave owners for the loss of what they called their property. Now, adjusted for inflation today, that would be worth around £2 billion, according to estimates from the Bank of England. The enslaved Africans received nothing. Not a payment, not land, no support system, nothing. And here's the part many people still don't realize. That money wasn't simply paid off to the slave owners in the 1800s. The British government took out a loan to fund these payouts. And that debt was only fully repaid in 2015. Which means for generations, British taxpayers were still paying for the compensation tied to slavery. And these were not small payouts. According to a study from the University College London, some of the names are still recorded today. For example, James Blair received £83,530 for over 1,500 enslaved people on a plantation in British Guyana. John Gladstone, the father of a future British Prime Minister, received over £106,000 for more than 2,500 enslaved people across 9 plantations. Robert Hibbert Jr. also received compensation over £10,000, as recorded in the same historical database. Now, adjusted in today's money, James Blair's payout would be about £13.8 million. John Gladstone's would be around £17.6 million, and Robert Hibbert Jr.'s compensation would be roughly £1.7 million. These were just portions of the payments that slave-owning families received, and they have been traced and documented by the University College London Legacies of British Slave Owners project. And even after so-called emancipation began, many of the formerly enslaved were pushed into what was called an apprenticeship system. On paper, it was meant to prepare them for freedom, but in reality, it kept them tied to the former masters. They were required to keep working, often up to 40 hours a week without pay, for years. Discipline was still enforced, punishment still existed, and refusal to work could lead to imprisonment. So freedom had been declared, but control had not truly ended. So what happened after that? Freedom mattered, of course it did, but freedom was not the same as justice. In the United States, institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau provided some support. Food, clothing, schools, hospitals, help with family reunification, but even that was limited, and it did not last for so long. Across much of the British world, many of the slaves walked out of slavery with nothing. No land, no compensation, no real support system. So the chains did come off their bodies, but the damage stayed with them. The wealth that was built from slavery stayed in the hands of states, banks, merchants, and plantation classes. The losses stayed with Africa and the African diaspora. And the ideas used to justify slavery, especially racism and black inferiority, outlived slavery itself. UNESCO says plainly that the slave trade enriched imperial powers and helped spread false narratives of white supremacy, whose effects still shape societies today. And that brings us back to Ghana. So what is Ghana actually hoping to get out of this? As of now, there is no final global settlement. Ghana is not sitting on a signed check, no. What Ghana, the African Union, and the Caribbean nations are pushing for is broader than that. Not just money, a formal apology, final redress, the return of stolen cultural property. That's very important. Some forms of debt relief, investment in education and health, and some long term development support. In simple terms, recognition, repair, and a fairer response to a crime that helped build the modern world. So, this whole conversation is not about dragging up some old history just for drama. No, it is about unfinished business. It is about a trade that ran for over 400 years. It is about millions of Africans who were taken forcefully from their homes. It is about coastal places in Ghana that still stand today as evidence. About slave owners who were paid while the enslaved were left to start over again with almost nothing. And it is about whether the world is willing to do more than remember. Because the real question now is not just what happened, it is what do we do with that history today? Do we acknowledge it fully? Do we repair what can be repaired? Do we change the systems that still reflect it? Or do we just leave it as something we only talk about and never act on? That is why Ghana is speaking now. Not because this story is new, but because for far too long, it has never fully been answered. And maybe now the world is finally being forced to face it. Thank you for watching this video to the end. And if you found it worth your time, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow the Black Star Brief for more stories like this. See you next time.